Hello, everyone. I'm Dan. With me, as always, is Tenian. Welcome to another episode of our Halloween Horror Fest. Today, we're going to be talking about a film that was a pretty big deal among horror fans in 2022. That's Parker Finn's Smile. It is Finn's feature-length directorial debut based off his short film from 2020 titled Laura Hasn't Slept. But we'll begin with a non-spoiler review. So there'll be two parts of the video. We'll begin with a non-spoiler. And then when we're ready to take a deeper dive into the film, talk more in depth about plot points, about plot developments, things like that. Then we'll alert you, and you'll be aware that we're passing into spoiler territory. Finn's film deals with Sosie Bacon's character, Rose Cotter. She is a doctor at a psychiatric ward. After witnessing a grisly suicide, she starts to experience what she first takes to be terrifying hallucinations. Eventually, she comes to suspect that something else entirely is going on, and that's where the idea of the supernatural forces at play in this film really start to take effect in the film. This is a supernatural horror film. It is a psychological horror film, but there is a definite supernatural component to it. It's a
Yeah.
film that relies on different layers of affective horror to make its impact.
The closest horror film that I could compare this to as a reference point would be It Follows. Like It Follows, very much a theme in this movie is trauma and passing down trauma to the next generation, and uses the premise of a curse for that idea of trauma being passed down, similar to It Follows.
It's a similar kind of horror in the sense that um, we're dealing with a kind of disembodied horror, a horror that doesn't settle into any one object. So, you think about creature features where, at least you've got this entity that is at least ostensibly bound by the laws of time and space, right? It's a creature that has to crawl through tunnels or lives in the ocean, wherever or whatever it is, there are, certain rules and apply to it. So it
Yes.
can't be everywhere at once.
Yep.
But with It Follows and then the malevolent entity and Smile, and I would also relate this to, in some ways, Freddy Krueger, this idea of an entity that isn't bound by the customary laws of time and space. So Freddy Krueger can get you in your dreams. All you have to do is fall asleep. The entity in It Follows, and I'll try not to spoil that one either. It can appear in any number of different ways. It doesn't have a fixed form. So it doesn't have a predictable appearance. There's
Yeah.
only so many ways you can see it coming at you.
Yeah.
It would be very easy to mix. Same
Yeah.
thing with the premise of Smile. Is like this thing is everywhere and nowhere, and you never really know when it's going to pop back up.
Yeah, yeah. The way it evokes a sense of mystery and maintaining that mystery like throughout to the very end, yet in key moments giving visibility and a visceral embodiment of the horror, and
Mm.
that in a way that did not deflate or detract from like that sense of mystery too. And the existential dread is still there and permeates everything, but it still gives you that visceral horror moment. And I thought those moments too is where it leaned more into the supernatural, but really managed to integrate the psychological and supernatural modes very well.
Yeah, definitely. And that's actually a nice segue for what I was going to say, which is, and again, no spoilers here, but this is a film that really invokes the idea of mental illness, emotional and mental trauma. So, trauma is a byword for this film. But what I thought was interesting about this film is the way it really kind of foregrounds trauma as just a plot point, an element of the actual overt story. The way that this film is channeling the idea of trauma and then the force of trauma, I think is pretty interesting when I compare it to other horror films.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I think that's one of the things that makes it really powerful. It may also make it controversial. I'm not aware of any particular controversy attaching to this film, but I did have a conversation with a friend shortly after seeing it for the first time, where they said, I really like the film. I just wish that the use of trauma had been different, because the message that emerged out of the film relating to trauma, they found that very disturbing, and thought that it could be very triggering or even maybe harmful to the wrong people who might see it. And I can kind of see where my friend is coming from. It's a film that has a particularly dark point to make about the nature of trauma. It goes someplace that you don't typically see the average horror film go.
Very much this film plays out like a nightmare, like the cyclical way a nightmare does. It keeps
Yes.
repeating itself nonstop, and that's how trauma operates. And it
Mhm.
does not leave much room for hope, being a horror film. And I can see how that could be controversial or triggering, particularly for people who have experienced mental illness or know someone who has experienced that to have to watch something that is playing all that out could be very disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, me personally, I mean, I have a different response to the film. Although, I mean, I can see the film being really triggering for somebody. I will say that. But I think that the film, I think in being so dark and in facing the issue of trauma in such a kind of visceral and head-on way, I think it's acknowledging something about the experience of trauma that we tend to try and skirt over just a bit too quickly, and that is that you know trauma is something that even if we find a way to live through it and synthesize it and recover and heal, it's always with us, or you know you don't an individual can't stuff trauma. We can't move on as if it never happened. I think one of the things that is so terrifying about the film is how lonely and isolating Rose Cotter's experience is. At a certain point it feels like there's just nobody she can turn to. And increasingly, as we get further and further on in the film, I at least have this sneaking suspicion that there is no hope, there is no help, that this thing is too powerful, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is very grim and upsetting. Very little glimmer of hope or relief from the horror or the trauma at the end, and very much ends on a note of horror.
For those of you who have been here for the non-spoiler portion, we're going into the spoiler portion now. So you can tune out and tune back in later. Yeah, well, so now that we're in the spoiler portion, I can say that the film's central entity, which I mean, it never gets a name. It's a nameless entity. It jumps from host to host. It's a parasitic, kind of demonic presence, and the way it attaches itself to people is through trauma. So, uh, Dr. Rose Carter, in the beginning, she witnesses Caitlin Stacey's character commit suicide in spectacular fashion, and that's what this thing does. Once a certain time period of demonic haunting has occurred, the thing murders its host through apparent suicide. But there's always a witness, and whoever witnesses the previous host kill themselves inherits the trauma and then is, ticketed for destruction themselves. And so it's this perpetual pattern, the cyclical pattern of trauma and suicide and demonic possession,
Which is
or at least.
qualified though, because it turns out that the emphasis is on the trauma. The manner of death has to be violent enough
Mm.
to traumatize the witness, but that could be in the form of someone killing themselves or murdering someone else. Yeah.
Right, right. And that comes into play as an important plot point as well, the idea that it can be murder as well. The scene I have in mind is one where Rose Cotter, she's gone to see the only surviving host of this thing. He's in prison for murder. Through talking with him, she learns that he survived because he passed the trauma on to somebody else. So it's similar to the haunted videotape on The Ring. If you if somebody else views that videotape, then they're the one, they're the ones who are going to die in 7 days, right? same principle here. If you pass the trauma on to somebody else through making them witness a brutal murder that you commit, then they become the newly haunted host, and you've passed your impending doom on to them. That's what this guy did. So he's spending his life in prison, but the payoff is he gets to live because of his crime. Now, the scene I find funny though is that shortly after that, Rose goes back to the hospital, the psychiatric ward where she works, and she's got a kitchen knife with her, and she's clearly contemplating whether or not this is something she can do. So she goes in and is in a room with this mentally disturbed patient, Carl, who's recurred throughout the film. And then she starts to kill him, like stab him with the kitchen knife. And then her boss, Dr. Morgan, comes in, he's watching it, and just the whole way that played out, like for those of you who've seen it, I don't know if you'll agree with me. Maybe I'm just by myself here, but like she's like stabs him once and she looks at him and she's like, okay, no, I'll try again. And then and then she's like,
Yeah.
stabbing, and he's like, ah. And then you cut to Dr. Morgan, and Dr. Morgan's like, oh, and like everyone's
Yeah.
like, oh, and
Yeah.
I just this is funny. This is really funny. Now, I think my reaction may have had something to do with the fact that the actor who plays Dr. Morgan is Cal Penn, best known for his comedy. He's probably best known for being in the Harold and Kumar franchise. So I identify him mostly with lighter, more comedic films. His presence in this film, I think, is really smart for the most part because it contributes to the cognitive dissonance. Like I see him and I expect to laugh.
Mm.
But with the exception of that one scene, nothing in this film is very funny. So I found it jarring. If the the humorous element had been a consistent pattern, if it had been something that I thought was a component of the film rather than just something that happened by accident that one time, it wouldn't be a nitpick of mine because I have no problem with horror films that are humorous. So it wasn't that. It's just that it felt out of place and something like they were going for something and they didn't quite hit it. Instead of being traumatic and disturbing, it was just kind of weird and funny to me.
Yeah, it was
Um,
awkward. Actually, I had the same reaction to it when that happened. It was like awkward because she was stabbing him, but not kind of fully committing to it. I mean, it did reflect the fact that, she's not, of course, at heart a killer. But yeah, it definitely came off as awkward more than anything else.
going into more detail about the idea of trauma in this film, I think it's really interesting that the Rose character and also the Lauren character from the beginning of the film, who kicks off the cycle, um, there's two layers of trauma to these characters. There's the obviously the plot point, the overt trauma of actually witnessing these spectacular suicides, these demonically possessed suicides. But then there's also the trauma they already live with, and it's specifically the trauma of having witnessed death. So Lauren, who kills herself at the beginning and infects Rose with this thing, she refers to watching her grandpa die when she was 7. Um, so Rose witnessed her mom die when she was young, and at least one other character has that as well. So there's this idea that this thing creates trauma and passes itself on that way. But it also, there's this implicit sense, at least, that it uses the trauma we have and may need that prior trauma as a basis for its infestation. I think one of the reasons that mental illness still is so stigmatized, as much as we're in this kind of unique moment where we want to talk about it, and it's less stigmatized, I think, at least in our culture than in a way it ever has been. At the same time, there clearly still is stigma, and I think one of the things that accounts for that has to deal with the idea that this is something that we can't see, can't touch, can't feel, and yet at the same time, it's an inherent part of us. It's this part of us that we can't exercise any kind of control over, and yet it's as fundamentally connected to who we are as our heartbeats or our central nervous system, right? So it's this idea that on a chemical level, on a level of the wrinkles in the brain caused by the impact of trauma, that there's this dark passenger in your mind who may wake up at any minute and start to inflict trauma on you.
Yeah.
And when it is activated, it's one of the hardest things in the world to actually overcome that.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
I think that's interesting in how that's kind of visualized too and smile through the smile itself, where the smile becomes a mask. It's representing trauma through an opposite emotion and connecting like something that would be more a symbol of life, which is what I associate with smiling as a kind of a life affirming thing to do. But here it's associated with death and trauma.
Yeah. To me, the smile invokes that. It's this terrifying realization that this thing that's supposed to symbolize happiness is just this death mask.
I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you about the ending, where, as I mentioned in the beginning, this movie gives like a visceral embodiment to the horror, and she goes to the abandoned family home, where the tragedy of her mother happened, and meets kind of a nightmare, monstrous version of her mother that I found pretty effective. Side note, like, forget his name. I should have written it down, but the practical effects person who's worked on like Aliens and other films, he did the practical effects for this. And I thought
Oh,
like,
wow.
yeah. So the practical effects and the makeup and just the way the creature, the entity was visualized as this nightmare maternal figure, I thought that was really, really, really good. And this, they showed just enough of it to evoke this like visceral, embodied, disgusting kind of horror, particularly when it peels off its skin and reveals that
Hmm.
grimacing, smiling mouth with all these like smaller, deformed, embedded mouths within it. That was like disgusting and terrifying.
It was great. And like I get very cranky about CGI, but I have no complaints about the use of CGI in this film. And I think that it was very deftly handled in conjunction with practical effects. And I think the combination of the two, when they come together, can be really special. The entity at the end, the monster mom, looks great, is really honestly terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that moment where, it finally manifests and starts to literally prise her jaw open and crawl inside her, that's utterly terrifying.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's a literalization of the way that severe mental illness can feel. So I thought it was powerful too.
Yeah, and I do appreciate when a horror film goes there and gives you those like moments of abject, visceral horror.
Each scene does add another layer of intensity and dread.
Yeah,
Uh, I think my favorite of those, with the exception of the climax, which obviously is the tour de force, is that moment where she realizes her therapist is not her therapist. The actress who plays the therapist is already kind of a intimidating presence. So when she actually goes into smile mode, it's just utterly awful. The shrink is a source of tragedy because she's her hands are tied by protocol, right? She can only go about this so many ways. And of course, she's also hand tied. Her hands are tied by ideology as well. Under no circumstances can she actually accept that there is any kind of supernatural explanation for what's happening to her patient. It has to be something medical. But I also think this film is a traditional work of horror in the sense that this thing is not just a symbol for trauma, right? If this thing were just trauma or even just a symbol for trauma, then I think that whole process she has at the end where she works through her mom and says, I have to leave you, or, has that process and her, sets her mom on fire and appears to get out of the cabin, that would have worked if this thing was trauma. It's not trauma, it just uses trauma. So whatever it is distinct from that. There's no getting out from under it because this thing, whatever it is supernatural, right? So it's, I think that the film is working symbolically on a lot of levels, but watching the film a second time, one of the things I don't think is symbolic is the entity itself. This thing is effing real and there's no explanation for it, and that's one of the reasons it's so powerful. So it's in that way it's similar to just about any other horror film you can conceive of.
yeah,
uh
yeah,
this thing is real, we can't accept it because it flies in the face of everything we thought we knew. That's one of
Yeah.
the reasons it's so powerful, is because nobody believes it's even a thing. Quick fact, this film was going to be just direct to video streaming service kind of thing. They weren't going to give it a theatrical release, but um, audience polling audience responses to it, testing audience responses were so positive that they decided to give it a theatrical release, and they're obviously glad they did.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was reading it had a $17 million budget and made something like 214 million at the box office. So I mean, one of the most successful, must have been one of the most successful movies of 2022 when it came out. I mean, that's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was like in the top 10 of most profitable films when you consider all the other expenses like advertising, marketing, etc.
Yeah.
So it made bank for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's really interesting that it did, because it is so just dark.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is it's a uniquely grim film, and grim and dread inspiring in a way that makes me kind of surprised that it was the hit that it was. It maybe says something about our cultural moment that a film like this is as popular as it is. I can't wait to see what he does with the sequel. We'll see if it's satisfying.
Yeah, I'm like really excited, like you said, for the sequel coming out in October, right in time for Halloween. Gonna definitely have to review that one as part of our Halloween-a-thon, Halloween Horror Fest here. Yeah.
Yes, please like and subscribe. But stay on with us. We'll be sending more content your way.